All right, today we're tackling a big one. We're looking at a source that asks a really provocative question. Is the Federal Reserve basically a parallel government running the show in the US? Let's dive right into their argument.
And boom, right out of the gate, this is the question the source wants us to think about. It really sets the stage, you know? It's all about power, who controls the money, and what that means for American democracy. So how exactly do they build this case? Let's find out.
Okay, first up, this whole idea of a parallel government. That's a pretty heavy term, right? So what does the source actually mean when they say that?
Well, their argument boils down to this. They believe there's this super powerful, unelected group right at the center of the U.S. financial system. And this group, they claim, has the ultimate power, the power to create and control money itself. So what's their evidence for a claim like that?
To get where they're coming from, we've got to pop the hood on what they call the money machine. We're going to look at how this source says money is really made and who's pulling the levers.
So here's how the source breaks down the Fed structure. First, they say it's undemocratic because nobody elects these folks. Then, non-transparent, claiming it doesn't have to follow the same transparency rules as other agencies. They even say it's beyond an audit, that the IRS can't even look at its books. The big picture they're painting here, a centralized system that's privately owned.
And to back up that privately owned claim, the source points specifically to the New York Fed. Get this, they allege that just two banks, Citibank and JP Morgan, own a whopping 72% of its shares. That's a huge claim, and this idea of concentrated private power is absolutely central to their entire argument. Okay, so what kind of money are we even talking about here? The source has a specific term for it, unbacked money. They trace it all back to 1971. That's the year the U.S. cut the dollar's tie to gold. And, according to this source, from that day forward, the dollar was basically created from nothing. Its value wasn't based on a chunk of gold in a vault, but just on faith. Now this next number from the source is pretty mind-blowing. They claim that 97% of all the electronic money out there isn't actually printed by the government. Instead, they say it's created out of thin air by big banks every single time they make a loan. That, according to the source, is the real money machine.
So that naturally leads to the next big question, right? Leadership. If the Fed really is this powerful, who gets to pick the person at the top? And, as this analysis asks, how much of a real choice is it anyway?
To drive this point home, the source brings up a really striking quote that it attributes to President George Bush. The suggestion here is pretty clear. Maybe even the President of the United States doesn't get to just pick whoever they want for the job.
Okay, so here's how the source lays out the appointment process. They say, sure, the president chooses and Congress gives the okay. But look at step one. The Fed itself supposedly hands over a pre-approved list of just 3 names. The argument is that this basically boxes the president in before the process even really starts. So what's the bottom line here, according to the source? It's pretty blunt. They argue that this whole setup means the will of the people, through their elected officials, isn't really in control of the Fed. They see it as a system specifically designed to keep the democratic process at arm's length.
All right, so now the argument zooms out from the U.S. to the entire globe. The source asks a really good question. If the dollar isn't backed by anything solid like gold, how on earth is it still the dominant currency around the world? Their answer? It all comes down to something called the petrodollar system. This little timeline really clarifies the source's point. You see the big shift in 1971 when the gold standard ends. After that, they claim a new plan was needed to make sure everyone around the world still wanted and needed U.S. dollars. And that plan, they argue, was to tie the dollar directly to oil, the one commodity everyone needs.
And this is where the source's argument gets really intense, maybe its most controversial point. It starts connecting the dots between this financial system and actual military conflicts, asking if wars are being fought to protect this monopoly on money.
The source really draws a line in the sand here. It's asking us to think, who really benefits from these wars? Is it the American people looking for peace and security? Or is it, as they suggest, this parallel government trying to protect the petrodollar system and, by extension, its exclusive power to create dollars?
And they don't just leave it as a question. They point to specific examples. They list all these global hotspots, highlighting disruptions to major trade routes. Importantly, routes that could be used for trade that doesn't involve the US dollar. The suggestion is that this isn't just a series of random events.
But here's the other side of that coin, according to the source. While all those other trade routes are facing chaos, they claim that the ones crucial for U.S. dollar trade, like the Panama Canal, are actually becoming more secure and more profitable. It creates this picture of, selective stability.
And that brings us right back to where we started, to the ultimate question this source is posing. It leaves us with this heavy thought. Could a private monopoly on creating unbacked money be a danger not just to American democracy, but to world peace itself? It's definitely a lot to think about.